Today I'm going to be talking about a song by one of my favorite piano-centered bands, Ben Folds 5. Ben Folds 5 doesn't really try to fit into any one box. They're a band that draws from influences of blues, rock, folk, and jazz. And I'm going to be reviewing their song called Kate off of their album Whatever and Ever Amen. So let's get right into it. I've shown the form on the bottom of the screen, and it pretty much is an elaboration of the AB-AB-CB form, which is a form where we encounter the bridge after 2 times of hearing the chorus. The instrumentation is also really simple. It's just piano, bass, drums, and vocals. So now let's bring our attention to the introduction. Here I'm just showing the left-hand part of the piano, which is also the bass line of the song. There's some rhythmic peculiarities that immediately pique our interest here, and it almost feels a little bit drunk by virtue of some beats that are missing in some places or inserted in other places. As a quick aside, I want to point out that the bass line, which repeats itself every measure, is pretty much made out of the F major blues scale. This song is in F major, as we can see by the key signature, and we can see that it's pretty much the major blues scale, which is really just a major pentatonic scale with a flat 3. So it's going to give this song kind of a sunny disposition, as that is typically how a major pentatonic scale would feel. And the flat 3 also adds a little bit of funk. To return to the rhythmic side of things, I want you to pay attention to this first bar, and you notice that it only has 3 beats, not 4. And precisely, it is the final beat of the bass line that is cut off in this first measure. So it almost feels like a false start, as if the song maybe trips over itself a little bit. And perhaps this was intentional, but it's also very possible that this was a mistake that was made during the recording session and they decided it sounded interesting and they wanted to keep it on the record. In bars 2 to 4, we have a rhythm in 4/4 that pretty much lines up with the beats. And what I mean by that is the fact that in each of these measures, the first quarter note is spanning the entire first beat. This quarter note spans the third beat, and then beats 2 and 4 are each composed of 2/8 notes each. And then something kind of weird happens in bar 5, and we'll come back to that. And when we get to bars 6 through 9, the bottom 4 bars, the rhythm now has changed a little bit, and it doesn't line up with the beats anymore. At this repetition of the bass line right here, these 2/8 notes are tied together to form a quarter note, and if we look at where the beats fall, beat 1 begins in the middle of this quarter note, and then beat 3 begins in the middle of this quarter note. So we don't have that alignment anymore. We have the syncopation. But it's actually the same rhythm, just started in a different place, because we still have, there's a structure of 1 quarter note. We have 1 quarter note, followed by 2/8 notes, another quarter note, and then 2/8 notes. Instead of starting, though, on the 1 of the measure, it starts an 8th note before the 1. So let's talk about that bar 5. What is going on in bar 5? Well, if you're paying attention and you notice the time signature change, relative to 1 measure of 4/4, this is going to have an extra 8th note. And what this extra 8th note allows for is we get a repetition of the bass line starting on the 1, and then we still have room to squeeze in another 8th note before starting the next measure. And then this ties in to the next 8th note to form that 1/8 note offset. But we really don't notice this because there's a pretty nifty drum fill that comes in here that kind of distracts us from what's going on. Furthermore, we've also got this fun little cowbell accent down here. And as a note, I'm going to be talking a lot about little percussive accents that they put here and there to spice up the piece. So when I write CB above one of these bars, I'm just meaning to say that the cowbell is playing this rhythm in that measure. Finally, the drums are establishing some sort of groove here where the accent is really on the 2 and the 4 and before 4. So the intro feels pretty seamless and tight, but something is kind of awry. And one of those big things is measure 5, which is a little bit strange. And admittedly, it took me many times listening through this part of the song before I finally realized what was going on here. Overall, this introduction is funky and unusual and helps set up the rest of the song. This syncopated bass line rhythm is really what dominates the verses. Vocal phrases also tend to begin on the 8th note before the 1 of each measure, just like the bass line. So now let's talk about part A. I'm showing the bass line here, and one of the things I really enjoy about this song is its killer bass line. And we have heard the part over F already, but if you look at the other chords that are in this part of the song, you can see that the bass line is really moving around quite a bit. It's not just playing the root of the chord and the fifth. Furthermore, I want you to notice that the piano right hand is playing its own different rhythm here, just playing straight eighth notes with the emphasis on the downbeat. So on the 1, 2, 3, and 4, not the ands. However, the bass line has accents elsewhere. It has the accents here. And so as you can see, these two rhythms don't line up with each other. They actually clash with each other quite a bit, but it adds a layer of interest to the piece. Finally, I want you to pay attention to the F major four-part diatonic chords, and notice that this part of the song is using entirely diatonic chords to the key of F major. And then an enthusiastic drum fill welcomes in part B for the first time. I'm also going to call this the chorus, and as is typical of most choruses, this part is louder, and they accomplish this with increasing the bass fuzz or the distortion, and the drum part also becomes louder by virtue of using the cymbals more. We have more percussive accents in this part of the song with a rattle sounding on bar 4 of this part of the song, but perhaps what sets part B apart from part A the most is its chords. Let's look at the first 4 measures first. We have A minor 7 walking down to G minor 7, which are 2 diatonic chords, but it's a chromatic walk down that goes through A flat 7, which is definitely not a chord that belongs in the key of F major. I want you to also pay attention to, I've drawn these chords out down here I want you to pay attention to the sevenths. Because when we look at the vocal harmonies that are sounding at this point, we have exactly that. We have G, the 7th of A minor, we have F, the 7th of G minor, and A, the 9th of G minor. So it's really drawing our attention to these more tonally sophisticated chords. We're not just using our basic triads. And then we encounter this really strange chord, this G minor 7 flat 5 over C. And you might be asking yourself, what business does such a strange chord have doing in the key of F major? Well, it is over C, and typically C, which is the dominant of F major, wants to go back to F. So it kind of does have that effect of drawing us back towards the tonic. What if I told you, too, that there was also a tritone in this chord that's resolved by going back to F major, the major 1 chord? Between G and D flat, there's a tritone and it resolves to the third between A and C. However, this is not the usual way that the resolution goes. Normally, it's a C7 resolving to an F, and in that case, we would have the tritone between E and B flat resolving to the third between F and A. So in the canonical resolution, the tritone resolves to the lower third of the major 1 chord, but in this alternate resolution, it's resolving to the upper third. And it turns out that substituting in dominants for other chords and then borrowing the bass note from the dominant is a move that occurs fairly often in tonally more sophisticated music. Finally, the instruments help to emphasize the tension of this chord by dramatically pounding these eighth notes in this rhythm, and furthermore, pausing right before resolving on F major, which creates that kind of peak in tension. We're finally dumped back out into 4 bars of F major that mimics the last 4 bars of the introduction with that F major blues scale bass line, as well as the cowbell and that drum groove that accents on the 2, the 4, and the and before 4. I'm going to refer to this section of F occurring for multiple bars as a vamp, because when we vamp on something, that means that we stay on the same chord for an extended period of time. And we'll see this vamp on F come back time and time again in this piece. Then we have part A one more time, and then part B comes again after that. For the next 35 or so seconds, nothing really changes musically until we encounter the bridge or part C. And I really think that this is my favorite part of the song because it kind of comes as a surprise and it does a lot of interesting things. First of all, we have some hurried 16th notes in the drums in the measure leading up to this part to signal its arrival. And the start of it is punctuated by a rattle. The drums also now begin playing eighth notes on the ride cymbal, which is the unique percussive feature of this part of the song. I've also shown the rhythm of the bass and the piano down here, which, as you can see, is different than previous rhythms we've seen. For example, this is the rhythm that we had in the verses. But once again, it is the chords that really make this part feel very different than anything else that we've heard before. We're starting with the C minor 7, which is a non-diatonic chord. And so it signals to us that something is probably going to change here. Yes, we have a bunch of other chords that are outside the key of F major. If we look a little bit deeper, though, we can say more about that. It appears that this part really messes with our sense of where the tonic is. So we have C minor 7 and B flat major 7. And you could say, hey, wait a minute, isn't that the minor 2 and the major 1 of B flat major? Well, yeah, it is. So maybe B flat is the tonic. But then we move to the next two bars and we get the minor 2 and the major 1 of A flat major. So maybe it is A flat instead. That's the tonic. Wait a minute. Over here we have the 2 and the 5 of G flat major. So even though I already showed it on the screen, what do we expect to follow after this D flat major chord? Well, it's very common to have minor 2 to major 5 to major 1 chord progressions. So G flat seems like a really logical choice, especially when we have D flat, which is a D flat 7 in the final beat, which is the dominant of G flat major. So it would naturally move to the tonic, G flat major. But instead, we're moving to G minor instead. And that's exactly a tritone away from D flat. So Ben Folds 5 could not have picked a more distant chord to move to. So it really jars us. It really wakes us up and it grabs our attention just in time for a fun little walk up during the G minor chord from A up to C in the bass. And then once again, we encounter that strange G minor 7 flat 5 over C. This time, the tension is emphasized by playing that chord in successively higher registers on the piano with each beat during those two bars that chord sounds. Then we return to that familiar vamp on F major, but something's changed a little bit. We've now got the addition of this B flat minor. And if you remember diatonic chords, well, B flat is the 4 of F, and the 4 chord is always major. So this minor 4 chord is a non-diatonic chord, and it tends to have kind of a sad, sort of sinister sound to it. And so what's going on essentially is we've returned to a familiar vamp on F major, which has that kind of happy, sunny feeling, but we've added a darker layer to it at the same time. So next we find ourselves in a pretty simple but very well-crafted instrumental section. A shaker enters in this part of the song, which is the unique percussive accent for this part. The piano's playing a pretty simple melody, to be honest, but it's a very beautiful melody. And furthermore, the harmonizing notes in this piano part are forming very consonant intervals. We've got two Fs here separated an octave apart. We have the a third above F, and then also a sixth below the other F. And as we know, thirds and sixths are very consonant intervals. And even though this main melody note, which is the bottom note here, moves around in tone, the harmonizing notes above it maintain those same interval relationships throughout. So we have a bunch of thirds and sixths. We also become acutely aware of how well the piano and its high register contrasts the low, heavy, muddy, fuzzy bass. And even though this contrast has been present throughout the entire song, this is the part where it becomes on full display and we can really appreciate it for all that it is. When the piano repeats the melody again, the vocals enter again, but it's not really words, it's just some ooh la las, and that adds another tonal layer to the song. And furthermore, that vocalization is in the rhythm of the piano and the bass that I showed in part C. Finally, I want to point out this end part of this melody, which is a simple tonal concept because we're just moving down the F major scale. But it's hard to play because we've got a bunch of notes moving very quickly, and we have to be very precise with our rhythms because they're not all the same length of note. And so this really just kind of goes to show how Ben Folds really knows his way around the piano. And to me, that's really what makes his work admirable as somebody who has played the piano for many years. So then as we enter the second instance of this melody, when we get to this riff, the end of this riff overlaps with the beginning vocals of part B again. So the transition is pretty seamless, and this part B is no different than previous times, except that it feels a bit more rushed and a bit faster than previously in anticipation of the end of the song. Typically, I have shown the vamp that follows as being part of part B. But in the final vamp, I've separated out into its own part that I'm going to refer to as the outro, because it's an F major vamp that's not the same as our original F major vamp. We once again have the addition of that B flat minor, which has that kind of sinister sound. In fact, this B flat minor is actually the chord that the entire song ends in. So perhaps when we saw that B flat minor for the first time at the end of the bridge, it was just foreshadowing where we were going to end up. At least that's how I like to think about it. Now, it's typical for songs to end and resolve on their tonic, so F major in this case. But of course, Ben Folds 5 defies our expectations once again. This is the bass line in the last measure of the song, and this is the final note that is played. After that note is played and we're on B flat minor in this bar, our ears are imagining that there's going to be some kind of dramatic pause before landing triumphantly on the tonic, because that's what we've learned to expect. Well, it turns out that this note is really the last note of the song. There's nothing else afterwards except for silence. So we've been fooled. And there's a lot of tension that is sitting on the table as well as a result. And you might be wondering, well, if it feels more resolved and more satisfying to return to the tonic, then how does this make the piece better? Well, I think it adds more interest because we're so conditioned to expect the resolution on the tonic that when it doesn't come, to me, it's like, oh, haha, you got me there. That's something different and unusual. And I can appreciate that. So Kate is a rhythmic and tonal powerhouse, and amazingly, it's accomplished by just 3 instruments in just over 3 minutes. Rhythmically speaking, we've got those interesting rhythms in the introduction, which grabs our interest immediately. We have those percussive accents like the cowbell and the rattle, which gives the song its flair. We have different rhythms in different sections. We've got syncopation, and we have the layering of different rhythms being played by different instruments, which adds more rhythmic depth. Tonally speaking, we've got that chord progression. It's kind of a fun one. It's got some unusual things going on, constantly keeping us on our toes, constantly defying our expectations, and taking us on trips outside the key of F major. Although the vocal harmonies are sparse, they highlight the seventh of our four-part chords and really emphasize the more sophisticated nature of our chords. And that bass line, gotta love the bass line. That's what makes it catchy. If we zoom out a little bit more and look at the song as a whole, at its form, it is kind of a typical form. We have the alternation between parts A and B that sets up a pattern that we expect, and then the bridge takes us somewhere different, and then we return to something familiar afterwards, but with some slight modifications. Although that is typical, what's very atypical of Kate is the refusal to resolve to the tonic at the end. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my review of Kate, and I will see you in the next one.